The worn leather work boots felt heavy on her feet as Maya pushed through the glass doors of Evan's construction. The reception area smelled of fresh coffee and sawdust, a familiar scent that usually felt like coming home. Today, it smelled like judgment. The receptionist, a woman with sharp glasses and sharper eyes, looked up from her computer. Her gaze traveled from Maya's faded jeans to her scuffed sneakers, lingering on her youthful face. The smile that had been forming vanished completely. "The temp agency sent you?" she asked, her voice flat. She didn't wait for an answer, already turning back to her screen with a dismissive wave. "HR is down the hall to the left. They handle the high school intern placements." Maya opened her mouth to explain, but the woman was already on the phone, her back a clear dismissal. A low whistle came from a cubicle nearby. A man with a hard hat perched on his desk leaned over to his neighbor. "Gable's gonna eat that kid alive," he muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. "The temp agency sent a child? Seriously? What's next? A mascot?" The words hung in the air, bouncing off the framed project photos lining the walls. Photos of her father standing proudly beside finished buildings, bridges, homes. Her father, who was supposed to be here, who was lying in a hospital bed instead, and had pressed his key fob into her hand just this morning with a weak, desperate squeeze. She could feel the eyes on her, the secretaries peering over their monitors, the project managers pausing their conversations. She was an anomaly here, a splash of youth in a sea of experienced, weathered faces. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, the one she used for school, and walked toward the hallway the receptionist had indicated. Her sneakers were silent on the polished concrete floor, but every step echoed in the sudden quiet of the open office space. She found the HR office, a small room with a nameplate that read, "M. Gable, Office Manager." The woman inside looked up, her expression a perfect mirror of the receptionist's. She had steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that assessed Maya in one swift, unimpressed glance. "You're the new filing assistant?" Mrs. Gable asked, not rising from her chair. She gestured to a precarious stack of cardboard boxes in the corner. "The previous temp left those in disarray. Alphabetize everything by client name, then by project date. The labels are in the top box. Don't mix up the active and archived files. We'll find you some real work if you can manage that without causing a catastrophe." Maya just nodded, swallowing the words that threatened to spill out. The explanation that she wasn't the temp, that her name was Maya Evans, that her father was Robert Evans, the name on the building outside, that he was in the hospital and she was here because he'd asked her to be. But the woman's dismissive posture, the way she'd already turned back to her spreadsheet, made the words die in her throat. This wasn't the time. She needed to understand what she was walking into first. She hauled the first box to a small, empty desk that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The chair squeaked in protest when she sat. As she opened the box, a cloud of dust made her cough. The files were indeed a mess, a jumble of invoices, permits, and client correspondence. She pulled out her notebook, not a school notebook, but a thick, leather-bound journal her father had given her, and set it beside the keyboard. A man in a crisp shirt and tie, carrying a blueprint tube, paused by her desk. "You lost, kid. Student career day was last month." He gave her a condescending smile before walking away, chuckling to himself. Maya took a slow, deep breath. She looked at the mountain of paper in front of her, then at the notebook on her desk. She opened it. The pages were filled not with class notes, but with her father's sharp, precise handwriting. Diagrams of load-bearing walls, notes on supply chain logistics, sketches of drainage solutions for problematic plots of land. And in the margins, in her own hand, were her questions, her observations, her calculations from years of summers spent following him everywhere. She wasn't just a high schooler and over her head. She was her father's daughter, and he had taught her everything he knew, not as a game, but as a language. The language of building, of business, of solving impossible problems. She picked up the first file. It was for the Ridgeview Shopping Center project. She knew that project. She'd been with her father when he'd first walked the empty lot. She began to sort, her movements methodical and calm. The whispers continued around her. The skeptical glances kept coming. But with each file she placed in its correct order, the weight on her shoulders felt a little less like panic and a little more like purpose. They saw a girl with a backpack. They had no idea about the secret education she carried with her. They didn't realize the temp agency hadn't sent her. Her father had. The tense quiet of the office shattered at 10:37. A phone rang, not with the usual polite chirp, but with an insistent, panicked shrill. Maya looked up from the filing chaos to see Frank, the head foreman for the Ridgeview project, slam his receiver down hard enough to make his desk rattle. His face was flushed a deep, angry red under the brim of his hard hat. "They what?" he bellowed, not caring who heard. "A paperwork error! That's impossible! We confirmed that delivery last week!" He listened for another moment, his free hand clenching into a fist. "I don't care whose fault it is. Without that steel rebar, 3 crews are standing around, costing me $1,000 an hour. The concrete pour is scheduled for tomorrow morning. This shuts us down." "Completely." He slammed the phone down again, the crack of plastic echoing through the suddenly silent office. Every head turned his way. He stood up, a mountain of flannel and frustration, and scanned the room, his eyes wild. "Where's Gable? Where's the office manager? I need someone who can actually fix this mess." Mrs. Gable emerged from her office, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What seems to be the problem, Frank?" she asked, her voice attempting calm but edged with tension. "The problem," he seethed, "is that our entire structural steel shipment for Ridgeview is sitting in a rail yard 2 states over because someone in this office," he jabbed a thick finger toward the cubicles, "messed up the customs clearance forms. We're dead in the water." Panic flickered across Mrs. Gable's face before she schooled her features. She started flipping through a binder on a nearby desk, her movements frantic. "There must be a copy of the bill of lading, the purchase order. We'll find the correct forms. We'll refile." "We don't have time for that," Frank roared. "It'll take days to untangle. I need a solution now. Isn't there anyone here who can actually handle a crisis?" His gaze swept over the accountants, who quickly looked down at their spreadsheets. The junior project managers who suddenly found their phone calls very important. It landed finally on Maya, still sitting at the temporary desk. For a moment, his anger seemed to deepen at the sight of her, a symbol of how useless the office had become. He shook his head in disgust. It was then that Maya stood up. The movement was quiet, but in the tense stillness, every eye snapped to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. But her voice, when it came out, was steady. Low, but clear. "The supplier's logistics manager is Jim Corbin. His direct line is 555-1087. He owes this company a favor from the Harbor Drive project last year when we took delivery of the mismarked I-beams without penalty." The silence that followed was heavier than Frank's shouting. Mrs. Gable froze, a piece of paper fluttering from her hand. Frank's angry glare shifted to one of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Maya met his gaze, her hands clenched at her sides to stop them from shaking. "Jim Corbin, at Great Lakes Steel. Call him. Mention Harbor Drive. He'll reroute the truck himself. It might cost us a rush fee, but it'll be here by dawn." Mrs. Gable found her voice first, a sharp, dismissive snap. "That is quite enough. Sit down. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're confusing things." She turned back to Frank. "Frank, let me pull the files. We'll handle this through proper channels." But Frank wasn't looking at her. He was still staring at Maya, his head slightly cocked. The panic in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something else. Intense, burning curiosity. "Harbor Drive," he repeated slowly. "That was a mess. How do you know about that?" Before Maya could answer, Mrs. Gable stepped between them, her posture rigid. "She's a temp, Frank. A high school temp. She's pulling numbers from a directory. She doesn't understand the complexity of this. We will handle this. Not a child playing secretary." The word child hung in the air. Maya saw the flicker in Frank's eyes die, replaced by the familiar frustration. He gave a short, sharp nod to Mrs. Gable and turned away, pulling out his phone to presumably start making angry calls through the official, useless channels. The moment was over. The subtle dismissal she'd felt all morning had just crystallized into outright, active resistance. They would rather watch the company burn than listen to the one person who might have a bucket of water. As Frank turned his back and Mrs. Gable began her frantic, inefficient search for paperwork, Maya's gaze dropped to her lap. Her fingers, hidden under the desk, traced the worn leather cover of her notebook. The panicked shouts about steel shipments and rail yards faded into a dull roar, and for a moment, she was 10 years old, sitting on an upturned 5-gallon bucket on a construction site. The sun was hot on the back of her neck. The air thrummed with the sound of heavy machinery and men shouting. Her father stood beside her, not in a suit, but in dusty work boots and jeans, a blueprint unfurled between his hands. "See this, Maya Bug?" he'd said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He pointed to a series of lines on the paper. "These are the rebar specs for the foundation. Without the right grade, the right delivery schedule, the whole project falls apart before we even pour the concrete. It's the skeleton. You have to protect the skeleton." He hadn't been giving a lecture. He'd been thinking out loud, including her in the process. That was his way. Her summers weren't for camp or vacations. They were for following him. While other kids learned to make lanyards, she learned to read load-bearing charts. While they swam in lakes, she walked half-finished skeletons of buildings, her small hand in his, listening. "Every problem has a history, Maya," he'd tell her, his eyes scanning the busy site. "A good manager doesn't just fight the fire. They learn why the fire started. They know who stores the gasoline and who knows how to work the hose." She remembered the Harbor Drive project he'd just silently referenced. She'd been 14. A truck had arrived with a shipment of I-beams, all stamped with the wrong grade designation. The foreman on duty had been ready to send them back, a costly delay. But her father had taken her to the trailer, sat her down with the original order forms and the supplier's manifest. "What do you see, Bug?" he'd asked. She'd pointed, hesitant. "The order number matches, but the product number on the steel is 1 digit off." "Right. Now, look at the spec sheet for that incorrect product number." She'd leafed through the thick binder. It's actually a higher grade, stronger." Her father had smiled, a rare, bright thing. "Exactly. Their mistake, but if we reject it, we lose 2 weeks. If we accept it, we get a better product, and we have leverage. We call Jim Corbin, we point out his error, and we accept the shipment as a favor to him. He owes us one." He'd let that sink in. Business isn't always about the contract, Maya. Sometimes it's about the relationship. Remember the people, and the numbers will make sense. He'd made her sit next to him as he called Jim Corbin. She listened to his tone, firm but fair, not accusatory. He'd given the man a graceful way out, and in doing so, had secured a debt of gratitude. That debt was now a phone number, burning in Maya's mind, a potential solution everyone was too panicked and proud to see. Her father's lessons were never formal. They were woven into the fabric of their time together. He'd quiz her on material costs during car rides. He'd show her how to spot a shaky foundation by the way water pooled after a rain. He taught her that the most important tool on any site wasn't the crane or the bulldozer, it was a notebook. "Your brain will forget, Maya," he'd said, handing her the first leather-bound journal on her 13th birthday. "Paper never does. You see something, you write it down. You hear a name, you write it down. A problem, a solution, a person who helped, a person who caused trouble. It all goes in the book." And she had. This notebook, now on her desk in this tense, silent office, was her 3rd volume. It was filled with her father's wisdom and her own observations. Diagrams of drainage systems, notes on which subcontractors were reliable and which cut corners. The personal cell number of Jim Corbin, logistics manager at Great Lakes Steel, scribbled in the margin next to a note about the Harbor Drive I-beams. The staff here saw a chaotic mess of files. She saw patterns. She saw the Ridgeview project files and knew from her notes that the soil analysis for the foundation had been borderline, requiring a specific grade of rebar for stability. The error wasn't just a paperwork delay. It was a threat to the structural integrity of the entire building. Their panic was justified, but their refusal to see a solution was arrogant. They looked at her and saw a child who belonged in a classroom. They didn't see the years of unofficial apprenticeship. They didn't see the countless weekends spent in her father's home office, him explaining cash flow projections like they were story problems. They didn't know she could read a blueprint as easily as a textbook, that she understood the critical path of a project timeline better than she understood algebra. The memory faded, the present rushing back in. Mrs. Gable was on the phone, her voice shrill, demanding to speak to a supervisor. Frank was pacing like a caged animal. The office hummed with a low, anxious energy. They were failing. The company her father had built with his own hands was stalling because the people in charge were too busy being important to be effective. Maya looked down at the file in her hands. It was for a different project, but the principle was the same. Every problem has a history. Every person has a history. She knew the history they refused to see. She closed her eyes for a second, hearing her father's voice. You have to protect the skeleton, Maya Bug. She wasn't a temp. She wasn't a child playing secretary. She was the only one in the room who had been trained for this exact moment. The silence around her was no longer intimidating. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. It was time to stop waiting for permission to fill it. The lesson was over. It was time to build. The phone on Mrs. Gable's desk rang with a specific, urgent tone Maya had come to recognize. The main line for Sterling Properties, their largest client on the Riverside condo project. Mrs. Gable, flustered from the rebar incident, answered it with a strained professional warmth that vanished in seconds. Her face went pale. Mr. Sterling, I understand your frustration, but I assure you... She was cut off, her shoulders slumping as the voice on the other end grew louder, audible even across the room. Yes, sir. The delays are unforeseen. Our project manager is unavailable. I will look into it immediately and call you back. She hung up, looking utterly defeated. He's pulling the contract, she whispered to no one in particular. He says the foundation delays have set the project back 3 weeks. He's invoking the penalty clause and taking the project to Dawson Construction. A collective groan went through the office. Losing Sterling wasn't just a financial blow, it was a massive hit to their reputation. Frank, who had been simmering quietly, threw his hands up. Well, that's it then. Without Sterling, we might as well pack up the whole company. Robert built that relationship over 20 years. He shot a dark look around the room, his anger looking for a target and finding everyone. Maya watched the panic solidify into despair. They were giving up. They saw one closed door and assumed the whole building was locked. She thought of her father's face, pale against the hospital pillows, trusting her with everything. She couldn't let this happen, not while she had a breath in her body. Without a word, she stood and walked to Mrs. Gable's desk. The older woman looked up, annoyed. What is it? I don't have time for... May I use the phone? Maya's voice was quiet, but left no room for argument. Absolutely not. This is not a game. Go back to your filing. Mrs. Gable, Maya said, her tone shifting, taking on a cadence that was unnervingly like her father's. If Mr. Sterling hangs up believing we have no solution, the deal is dead. If I get him on the phone and fail, the result is the same. There is no downside to letting me try. The logic was irrefutable. The office had gone utterly silent again, all eyes fixed on the standoff. Mrs. Gable, cornered and out of options, finally pushed the phone across the desk with a sigh of exasperation. Fine, hang this mess around your own neck. See if I care. Maya's hands were steady as she picked up the receiver. She dialed the number for Sterling Properties from memory, a number she'd seen 100 times in her father's notes. She took a slow breath, calling up every lesson, every overheard conversation, every moment of quiet observation. Mr. Sterling's office, a crisp voice answered. Hello, this is Maya Evans, calling for Mr. Sterling regarding the Riverside project. It's urgent. She used her father's last name without a flicker of hesitation. There was a pause, then a click. This is Henry Sterling. His voice was ice. And I've just finished speaking with your office manager. I believe our business is concluded. Mr. Sterling, my father asked me to call you personally, Maya began, her voice calm and respectful, yet firm. He's temporarily unavailable, but he's deeply concerned about the Riverside project and specifically asked that I address this with you. There was a beat of silence on the line. Robert's daughter? The ice in his voice thawed just a fraction, replaced by curiosity. Yes, sir. I'm managing the office in his absence. I've reviewed the project timeline, and I understand your frustration with the Foundation delays. However, I believe the initial schedule was overly optimistic given the soil composition on the riverbank. The geotechnical report, which I have right here, indicated a high probability of a slower pour and cure time for the footings. My father's original proposal actually built in a 2-week buffer for this exact scenario. She could hear his sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She was speaking a language he understood. Not excuses, but specifics. Data. The buffer was removed during the final contract negotiations by your team, Mr. Sterling, to shave costs. We're actually only 1 week behind the realistic engineered timeline. The 3-week delay you're citing is based on the optimistic, amended schedule. The silence from his end was different now. It was the silence of a businessman recalculating. Maya pressed her advantage, her voice remaining even. The rebar issue this morning has been resolved. The trucks will be here by dawn. We will pour tomorrow. And to make up the 1 week, I am reallocating our framing crew from the finished Oak Street project to Riverside starting Monday. They're our fastest team. We will have the superstructure ahead of schedule by the end of next month. More than compensating for the Foundation delay, you'll be back on your original possession date without any compromise on quality or safety. She paused, letting the detailed concrete plan settle in the space between them. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was presenting a superior path forward. My father always said a Sterling Properties home is defined by its foundation, not by its closing date. We want to build this right for you, sir, as partners. The silence stretched for so long Maya thought the line had gone dead. Then, Henry Sterling let out a short, surprised laugh. Partners. Robert did say that. All right, Maya Evans. You have your father's nerve and his attention to detail. The penalty clause is suspended. Get me back on schedule. And tell your father he owes me a round of golf when he's back on his feet. The line clicked. Maya slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The entire office was frozen. They had heard only her side of the conversation, but her calm recitation of geotechnical reports and crew allocations, followed by the clear resolution in her tone, told them everything they needed to know. Mrs. Gable was staring at her, her mouth slightly open. Frank had taken his hard hat off and was running a hand through his hair, looking at Maya as if seeing her for the very first time. The stunned silence was no longer filled with doubt, but with a dawning, profound shock. The teenage girl in the worn sneakers had just single-handedly saved their biggest client. And she'd done it not with loud demands, but with quiet, undeniable competence. The silence after Henry Sterling hung up was a physical thing, thick and heavy in the air. It was broken by the soft thud of Frank's hard hat hitting his desk. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his large, calloused hands resting on the particle board, staring at Maya. The anger that had been boiling off him all morning had evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unvarnished shock. It was the look of a man who had been so certain of the world's order, only to see it upended in a single phone call. Across the room, Mrs. Gable slowly sank into her chair. The dismissive sharpness was gone from her posture, her shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in bewildered reassessment. She looked at the phone, then at Maya, then back at the phone, as if trying to reconcile the instrument with the impossible conversation it had just carried. A junior accountant was the first to move. He walked over to Maya's temporary desk, not looking directly at her, his focus on the chaotic box of files. He started, his voice hesitant. The vendor codes for the Ridgeview project. You sorted them by date, but the system cross-references by client PO number. I could show you how to reorganize them if that would help. It wasn't an order. It was an offering. A tentative white flag of curiosity. Maya simply nodded. The PO numbers are on the second line of the invoice header. I'll resort them. Thank you. Her calm acceptance of the help, without a hint of triumph or gloating, seemed to ease the tension another degree. An hour later, it was one of the project managers, a woman named Lena, who had been holding her own closed-door meetings all morning. She approached Maya's desk with a set of blueprints rolled tightly in her hand. She didn't go to Mrs. Gable's office first. She came straight to the temporary desk. "Maya," Lena said, her tone professional, yet lacking its earlier dismissive edge. "We're hitting a snag with the zoning permits for the Elm Street renovation. The inspector is citing a new code amendment about setback requirements. I can't find the digital copy of the latest revision. Do you recall seeing a physical copy come through, maybe in one of those boxes?" Maya didn't need to check her notebook for this. She'd seen the mail cart yesterday. "It's in the pending approvals box on Mrs. Gable's credenza, the top right corner. It arrived Thursday with the utility bills." Lena blinked, then turned and walked to the office manager's doorway. "Marcia, the Elm Street zoning amendment? Maya says it's on your credenza." Mrs. Gable looked, rifled through a pile, and pulled out the very document. She held it, her expression unreadable, as Lena took it with a quiet, "Thank you." Lena paused on her way back to her desk, giving Maya a short, respectful nod. This was the new pattern. The questions started small, logistical. Where was a specific form? Had a certain shipment been logged? But soon, they evolved. A foreman would stop by to ask if she knew the lead time on a specific window model her father always used. An accountant would double-check a client's payment history against a note in her ledger. Maya answered them all with the same quiet certainty. She didn't offer more than was asked, but she never had to hesitate. The information was all there, in her head and in her meticulously kept notebooks. Her leadership wasn't declared. It was demonstrated. One precise answer at a time. The resistance in the office was melting, replaced by a growing collective curiosity about the true depth of the quiet girl with the worn-out notebook and the unexpected command of their world. The tide, once firmly against her, was beginning to turn. The shift was subtle at first, a quiet hum of productivity that felt different from the anxious tension of the previous days. The rebar had arrived at dawn, just as Maya had promised Frank it would. The Sterling Properties project was back on track, the threat of penalties lifted. The office was running, but beneath the surface, a new current was flowing, one of wary respect, directed at the quiet girl who now occupied her father's large leather chair in the corner office. She hadn't moved her things in. Her backpack and notebook still sat on the temporary desk. But when a problem arose, eyes now drifted toward that door. It was this new, fragile piece that Maya shattered on Thursday afternoon. She had been working through lunch. The door to the office closed. Spreadsheets and invoices were spread across the massive desk, her father's desk. The numbers hadn't added up for weeks, not in the way Mrs. Gable's reports claimed they did. The discrepancy was clever, hidden across multiple projects and expense accounts. A slow bleed rather than a gushing wound. But a bleed will kill you just the same, given time. She had traced it all back to its source. The realization had turned her stomach to ice. This wasn't just an error. It was a pattern. A deliberate, systematic diversion of funds that predated her father's hospitalization by months. The company wasn't just struggling under temporary leadership. It was being systematically hollowed out from within. She stood up, her movements stiff. She gathered the evidence, not just her own calculations, but the original invoices, the bank statements, the doctored reports she'd cross-referenced. The stack of paper in her arms felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She opened the office door and walked into the main room. The usual office sounds, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of phone calls, died instantly. Every head turned. She didn't look at any of them. Her gaze was fixed on the large conference table at the far end of the room. "Could everyone please gather round for a moment?" Her voice was calm, but it carried, clear and firm, across the silent space. It wasn't a request from a temp. It was the instruction of someone in charge. There was a moment of hesitation, a collective glance exchanged. Then chairs began to scrape back. Frank stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, his expression serious. The accountants closed their ledgers. The project managers set down their phones. Mrs. Gable emerged from her office, her face a tight mask of confusion and apprehension. They formed a hesitant half circle around the conference table, a silent audience awaiting a performance none of them had bought tickets for. Maya placed the stack of documents on the polished wood with a soft thud. She didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, looking younger than ever in her simple t-shirt, yet somehow older than all of them combined. Her hands, she noticed, were steady. "For the past several days," she began, her eyes scanning the faces before her, "I've been reviewing the company's financials. My father asked me to ensure everything was in order during his absence." She let the words hang there, a simple statement that contained a universe of unspoken meaning. "My father asked me." She picked up the top spreadsheet, one of Mrs. Gable's own monthly financial summaries. This report from last month shows a net profit of 2% on the Ridgeview project. She set it down and picked up a thicker sheaf of papers, photocopies of raw material, invoices, subcontractor bills, payroll records. These are the actual logged expenses for that same project. When you cross-reference them, the actual net profit was negative 4%. A soft gasp came from one of the junior accountants. Mrs. Gable's face went pale. "Those are preliminary numbers," she said, her voice strained. "I hadn't finished the reconciliation. There's no need for this public spectacle. The reconciliation has been unfinished for 3 consecutive months. Mrs. Gable," Maya said, her tone neutral, factual, "on every major project. The discrepancies aren't random. They follow a pattern." She turned her attention to the group, holding up an invoice from an electrical subcontractor, Prime Wire Solutions. "This invoice is for $48,000 for the Sterling Properties job. It was approved and paid." She then held up a purchase order. "The contract with Prime Wire, signed by my father, locked their labor rate at $95 an hour for that project." She did a quick calculation on a notepad. "At that rate, for the hours billed, this invoice should total $34,200. The room was so quiet, they could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "That's a difference of nearly $14,000, Frank said, his voice a low rumble. He was staring at Mrs. Gable, not at Maya. "It is," Maya confirmed. She then picked up another document. "This is a bank statement. The payment of $48,000 was made to Prime Wire. But this," she held up a second bank document, "is a transaction from Prime Wire's account made the same day for $13,800. It was deposited into an account numbered 4839772. She let the papers fall to the table. She looked directly at Mrs. Gable, whose face was now a ghastly shade of gray. "The account numbered 4839772 is your personal savings account, Mrs. Gable." The accusation landed in the room like a bomb. No one moved. No one breathed. The trusted office manager, the woman who had been with Robert Evans since the beginning, the one who had scoffed at the high school temp. "This is outrageous," Mrs. Gable spluttered, finding her voice, though it was shrill and unconvincing. "You're a child. You're fabricating lies. You don't understand accounting. Those transfers are for consulting fees, authorized by your father." "The consulting fees," Maya said, her voice still dangerously calm, "are listed in a separate ledger. They were paid in full last quarter. And my father's signature on this invoice," she tapped the $48,000 sheet, "is a forgery. I've compared it to every document he signed in the last year. The slant is off. The pressure is wrong." She looked around the table at the stunned, horrified faces of her colleagues. "This isn't a single mistake. It's a system. Inflated invoices, kicked back funds, forged approvals. Over the past 8 months, using this method across 4 different projects, just over $200,000 has been diverted from this company." The number sucked the air out of the room. $200,000. It was a number that meant layoffs. It meant projects left unfinished. It meant the very real possibility of Evans' construction collapsing under the weight of the theft. The foundation delays, the budget overruns, Maya continued, her gaze sweeping over them. They weren't just bad luck. They were a symptom. The money that was supposed to pay for quality materials, for reliable crews, was being siphoned away. The skeleton of this company wasn't just weak. Someone was stealing the bones. She finally turned her full attention to Mrs. Gable, who had sunk into a chair, her hands trembling violently. You were counting on the chaos of my father's absence to hide it. You were counting on everyone being too busy or too doubtful to listen to me. You were wrong. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of trust shattering, of perceptions being violently rearranged. The person they had all relied on, the model of efficiency and propriety, had been systematically bleeding the company dry. And the person they had all dismissed, the girl in the worn sneakers, had been the only one sharp enough and cared enough to see it. The stunned silence in the conference room stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of Maya's revelation. All eyes were fixed on Mrs. Gable, who seemed to have shrunk in her chair, a monument to exposed deceit. But then, slowly, those same eyes began to shift back to Maya. The shock of the theft was now mingled with a deeper, more profound confusion. How? The question hung unspoken in the air. How could a high school student who had been sorting files just days ago unravel a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had fooled seasoned professionals? Frank was the one who finally gave the question a voice. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room. His gaze on Maya was no longer just shocked or respectful. It was openly bewildered. Maya, he began, his tone careful, almost gentle. This is incredible work. You saved this company, but how? How did you know where to look? How did you understand all this? He gestured at the complex spreadsheets, the layered financial documents. This isn't something you learn in math class. Maya looked at the faces around the table. She saw the dawning realization in Frank's eyes, the stunned curiosity in the accountant's, the utter loss in Mrs. Gable's. The secret she and her father had kept for years, their private language, was no longer hers to hold on to. It belonged in this room now as an explanation. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing against the cover of the leather notebook she had carried with her to the table. My father, she said, her voice softening for the first time. He never really saw a difference between his office and our home, or a construction site and a classroom. She opened the notebook, revealing pages filled with dense, precise handwriting, both his and hers, diagrams, formulas, notes on subcontractors, sketches of structural solutions. When I was 7, he started taking me to sites on weekends. Not to play, but to watch. He'd point to a foundation and ask me how many trucks of concrete it would take to fill it. He'd show me a blueprint and make me find the error. It was a game to me, at first. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. But the games got more complex. She flipped through the pages, showing glimpses of her father's distinctive script next to her own, neater handwriting. By the time I was 12, I could read a profit and loss statement. At 14, he was teaching me how to negotiate with suppliers, how to spot a padded invoice, how to manage a project's critical path. He called it my side education. He said school taught me how to think, but this taught me how to build, how to solve. She looked up, meeting their stares. This notebook? It's my 3rd one. It has every lesson, every problem we ever worked through together. The Harbor Drive project with the mislabeled I-beams? It's in here. The zoning battle for the Elm Street property? It's in here. The name of Jim Corbin at Great Lakes Steel and the favor he owed us? It's in here. She tapped the page. He didn't just teach me the answers. He taught me how the whole machine works, how every gear turns, how to listen to the sounds it makes and know what's wrong. She let her gaze fall on the damning evidence against Mrs. Gable. I knew something was wrong the moment I started looking at the real files, not the summaries. The machine was making a sound it shouldn't. The numbers didn't tell the right story. They were telling Mrs. Gable's story. I just listened to what my father taught me to hear. The room was utterly still. The revelation was as staggering as the embezzlement itself. Robert Evans, their brilliant, demanding, private boss, had been quietly grooming his daughter for this very role her entire life. He hadn't left them with a clueless child. He had left them with his own prodigy, his secret apprentice, armed with a depth of institutional knowledge that dwarfed their own. The dismissive glances at her sneakers, the jokes about the temp agency, the muttered comments about a child, it all curdled in the air, replaced by a humbling, awestruck shame. They had underestimated her because of her age, her appearance, her quiet demeanor. They never imagined that the most qualified person to save the company had been sitting among them all along, her true capability hidden in plain sight, written in the pages of a simple, worn-out notebook. The secret was finally unleashed, and it changed everything. The silence that followed was not the quiet of shock, but of resolve. Frank was the first to move, his large frame straightening as he turned from the evidence on the table to face Maya. The last traces of doubt had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a clear, steady focus. "All right, then," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried through the still room. "What's the play, boss?" The word wasn't a joke. It was an acknowledgement, a passing of the torch. He looked at her, waiting for orders. Maya didn't hesitate. The lessons were over. It was time to build. She began issuing instructions, her voice calm and precise, each directive aimed at a different person in the circle. "Lena, I need you to contact Prime Wire Solutions directly. Speak only to the owner, bypass their accounting department, explain the situation with the forged invoice. We need a corrected invoice and a written statement today." Lena nodded, already pulling out her phone, her earlier skepticism replaced by immediate action. "Frank," Maya continued, "the Ridgeview pour is this afternoon. I need you on site. Verify the steel delivery against the original specs, not the purchase order, personally. Don't leave until the concrete is setting." "On it," Frank said, grabbing his hard hat from the table and striding out without a backward glance. She turned to the junior accountants. "David, Sarah, I need a full forensic audit of every project from the last 12 months. Start with vendor payments and cross-reference every signature against the notarized copies in the vault. Flag every anomaly, no matter how small." The two accountants, wide-eyed but determined, scurried back to their desks, the weight of the task evident in their hurried steps. Finally, she looked at the remaining project managers. "The rest of you, back to your teams. Communicate clearly. The delays are being resolved. The projects are secure. Morale is your priority now." They dispersed, a new energy in their movements, the confusion replaced by purposeful direction. Only Mrs. Gable remained at the table, a silent, crumbling statue. Maya's gaze softened fractionally, but her tone remained firm. "You will remain in your office. You will answer any questions the auditors have. You will not access any systems." It was not a request. It was a containment strategy. For the rest of the day, the office hummed with a different frequency. It wasn't the anxious panic of before, or the dismissive gossip of her first day. It was the sound of a machine finally operating as it was designed to, each part moving in sync with a clear, common purpose. Phones were answered with renewed confidence. Emails were sent with definitive answers. Problems were solved with efficiency, not escalation. Maya moved through it all, not from the corner office, but from her temporary desk. She was the calm center of the storm, reviewing the auditors, initial findings, approving revised schedules. Her father's notebook opened beside her like a trusted co-pilot. When a foreman called with a question about a soil compaction test, she didn't refer him to someone else. She asked for the specific coordinates of the test site, pulled up the geotechnical report on her laptop, and gave him the acceptable PSI range, her voice sure and steady. The foreman's grateful, "Thank you, Maya," echoed a new reality. The doubt was gone. In its place was a hard-earned, unquestioning trust. The redemption was not in words, but in the smooth, powerful action she had unleashed. The following Tuesday, a familiar black pickup truck pulled into the reserved spot outside the glass doors. The engine cut, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Inside the office, the new rhythm held. Focused, efficient, a quiet hum of purpose. Maya was at her desk, not the temporary one, but her father's, reviewing the final audit report. She didn't see the truck at first. The door pushed open. Robert Evans stood there, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. He looked thinner, his face still carrying the pallor of his illness, but his eyes were clear. He scanned the office, his expression braced for the worst, for the chaos, the panic, the disarray he feared he'd left behind. He saw none of it. He saw Frank leaning over a project manager's desk, pointing at a blueprint, their conversation low and focused. He saw the accountants at their terminals, their postures intent, not defeated. He saw the receptionist on the phone, her voice calm and professional. The air didn't smell of crisis. It smelled of coffee and resolution. His gaze traveled the room, absorbing the strange, vibrant order, and finally landed on the corner office, on the figure sitting in his leather chair. For a heartbeat, his breath caught. His daughter, his Maya bug, was dwarfed by the high-backed chair, her head bent over a thick stack of papers. She looked up, sensing his presence, and their eyes met through the glass wall. The entire office had gone silent again, but this was a different silence. It was a held breath, a collective waiting. Frank looked up from the blueprint, a slow grin spreading across his face. The receptionist quietly ended her call. Maya stood and walked out of the office to meet him. She didn't run. She walked with a steadiness he'd never seen in her before, a quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her. She stopped a few feet from him. "Dad," she said, her voice warm with relief. "You're early," the doctor said afternoon. He could only stare, his hand tight on the cane. He looked from her face to the organized bustle of the office, then back to her. "Maya," he began, his voice rough with emotion. What happened here? I was expecting a 5-alarm fire." It was Frank who answered, stepping forward, his hard hat in his hands. "The fire's out, Robert. Thanks to her." He nodded toward Maya, his respect palpable. "She didn't just put it out. She rebuilt the whole station while she was at it." Robert's brow furrowed, confusion and dawning amazement warring on his face. "What did you do?" Before Maya could answer, Mrs. Gable emerged from her office. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She carried a small cardboard box filled with her personal effects. She didn't look at anyone but Robert. "Robert, I need to speak with you in private." Her voice was a shattered whisper. Robert's eyes narrowed, his businessman's instincts kicking in. "Marcia? What's going on?" Maya stepped in, her voice calm, mercifully sparing him the public details. "There was a financial discrepancy, Dad, a significant one. Mrs. Gable has chosen to resign while we complete the audit and involve the authorities. The full report is on your desk." The pieces clicked into place for Robert with an almost audible snap. The two perfect reports, the constant budget overruns he could never quite pinpoint, the feeling that the company was bleeding money no matter how hard he worked. He looked from Marcia's broken form to his daughter's unwavering gaze. His child had not only kept the company afloat in his absence, she had performed surgery on it, cutting out a cancer he hadn't even known was there. The pride that swelled in his chest was so immense, it felt like a physical pressure. It was followed immediately by a wave of gut-wrenching guilt. He had left her alone with this. He had thrown her into the deep end, trusting her with his life's work, but never imagining the sharks that were circling it. "Maya," he said, his voice thick. He reached out, his free hand squeezing her shoulder, needing the solid feel of her to ground him. "I'm so sorry. I never should have. I didn't know." She placed her hand over his, her touch firm and reassuring. "It's okay, Dad. You taught me how. I just listened." The simple statement undid him. He pulled her into a careful, one-armed hug, his cane clicking against the floor. Over her shoulder, he saw his employees, his team, watching the reunion. He saw no pity, no judgment. He saw respect. For her. He saw a unity he hadn't seen in years. The company he had built was still standing, but it was different. It was stronger, and it was because of the daughter he had underestimated. He finally released her, wiping hastily at his eyes. He looked around at everyone, his voice stronger now, filled with a profound, grateful authority. "All right, everyone, back to work." It was the same command he'd given for decades, but this time it was layered with a new, unspoken thank you. They obeyed, the spell broken, the efficient hum returning. He turned back to Maya, his eyes shining. Show me everything. The days that followed her father's return were not a return to the old way of things, but the solidification of a new reality. Maya no longer sat at the temporary desk. Her father had a new one brought in, placing it right beside his own in the corner office. "Partners," he'd said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The worn leather notebook now had a permanent place next to the computer monitor, its pages filled with a new kind of note. Decisions made, problems solved, her own authority quietly documented. The change in her was not loud or boastful. It was a deep, internal shift that manifested in the way she held herself. The hesitant slouch was gone, replaced by a straight-backed confidence that seemed to settle into her bones. She no longer waited to be spoken to in meetings. She spoke, her voice calm and her points precise. The project managers listened, their nods respectful, their questions directed to her as often as to her father. She had earned her place not through a name, but through action, and the respect was real and unshakable. Her relationship with her father had fundamentally altered. The dynamic was no longer just father and daughter. It was mentor and protege, yes, but also colleagues. He consulted her on bids, genuinely valuing her opinion on subcontractor reliability and material sourcing. He'd watch her sometimes, a look of awe and lingering guilt in his eyes, as she deftly handled a call with a difficult supplier or pointed out a potential scheduling conflict he'd missed. The wall that had once separated his professional life from his personal one had been dismantled, and Maya now stood firmly in both worlds, whole and complete. The most telling transformations, however, were in the others. Frank, the gruff foreman, would stop by her desk, not with problems, but with a thermos of coffee his wife had made, for the brains of the operation. The junior accountants, David and Sarah, now came to her first with questions, their previous condescension replaced by an eagerness to learn from her methodical approach. The doubters had become her staunchest advocates, their apologies unspoken but evident in every interaction, every gesture of deference. They saw not a girl, but the person who had pulled them all back from the brink. Internally, Maya felt the world had clicked into a sharper focus. The vague anxiety about her future that had plagued her senior year was gone, replaced by a clear, steady purpose. The experience had sanded down her own insecurities, revealing a core of strength she hadn't known was there. She wasn't just Robert Evans's daughter anymore. She was Maya Evans, the one who could read a blueprint and a balance sheet with equal skill, the one who had stared down a crisis and not blinked. The girl with the backpack was still there, but she had been forged into a young woman who knew her own capability, and that knowledge was the most powerful tool she now possessed. 1 month to the day after Robert Evans returned, he called a full staff meeting. The mood was light, a stark contrast to the tense confrontations of the past. When everyone had gathered, he stood before them, leaning lightly on his cane. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice ringing with pride. "The position of Chief Operations Manager is no longer vacant." He turned to his daughter. "Maya has accepted the role permanently. She will oversee daily project management, client relations, and financial oversight." He didn't ask for a vote. He stated it as a fact, the only logical conclusion to the story they had all lived. The applause was immediate and genuine, led by Frank's loud whistle. There were no more skeptical glances, only nods of approval. Maya stood, her composure steady, and accepted the new keycard he offered. Her decision had been made in the quiet of the hospital, watching him sleep, understanding the weight of the legacy and her own capacity to carry it. The office culture had undergone its own construction project, rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and transparency. The final proof that capability knows no age was no longer just Maya's story. It was the new operating principle of Evans Construction. The last image was of Maya at her desk, not as a temp or a fill-in, but as a confident leader, calmly directing her team, the once doubtful staff now her most dedicated crew.